Hi and welcome to the Journalism Salute. I'm Mark Simon. In each episode, we'll talk to or about an interesting person or organization related to journalism. The intent is to show that journalists are not the enemy of the people. Thank you for listening. Ted Bridis is a professor of investigative journalism at the University of Florida. The position he holds is one created in honor of Rob Hyson, one of the Capital Gazette staffers who was killed in 2017. He's also had a long career as an investigative journalist and editor. His team won the 2012 Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting on New York Police Department intelligence programs. He and his teams have done prominent work related to Hillary Clinton's email server, Paul Manafort and Rick Gates' covert foreign lobbying, and he was also part of the AP team that projected winners in 4 presidential elections, including 2016. And he was the administrator of the Collier Prize and one of the 7 judges that was won by the reporting team from the Miami Herald that we talked to in our last episode. Thank you for joining us.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
So let's get a little sense of your origin story. And I was listening to an interview last night where you talked about knowing that you wanted to do this in middle school. So I'm curious if there was something in your upbringing that lent itself to investigative reporting and then teaching it.
Yeah. You actually have to go all the way back to 1970, and you got to go to Vietnam. And a young husband and a father to a toddler is a lieutenant in the Army Corps of Engineers, and he's assigned to clear a mountaintop for a howitzer base. And he's a former state high school football champion from Miami, defensive back, also played Division I football at the Citadel, the military academy. And a mortar attack in the morning, happens on that mountaintop, and he loses both legs and his right arm. And he's near death, and he's dragged 3 times out during the shelling to Army medical helicopters before he can be flown to a field hospital in Chulai, and then eventually on to Saigon, and then finally on to Walter Reed Hospital in Washington. And that was Ted Bridis Sr. That was my father. And, our hometown newspaper, the Miami Herald, decides that this athletic young Ted Bridis should be the public face of the human toll from the Vietnam War. And he's the heroic local athlete who earns the Purple Heart and the Bronze Star, and was, emblematic of the loss that other veterans from South Florida and elsewhere had suffered in Vietnam in this war. And Knight Ridder, who owns the Miami Herald, they send their war correspondent, James McCartney, to visit my father during his recovery in Saigon at the hospital. And we, the family, my mom and myself, we haven't even seen my dad at that point. We're just getting telegrams, really serious, concerning telegrams about his situation. And McCartney writes in a column that's published in the Herald that my dad is swathed in bandages and he can barely speak. And he's slowly lifting up his left arm, and he's clenching his fist, and sweat is dripping off his face, and he's exercising because he knows that one day, if he survives, that left arm is all he's got. And McCartney says that he talks to the doctors, and the doctors give my dad a 1 in 10 chance of surviving. And the doctor says he might just make it. He's got the motivation. He wants to live. And over the years, the Herald kept tabs on us. They updated their readers. When we moved into a new home that was wheelchair accessible, when my sister was born a couple years after his injury, my dad finished his master's degree in engineering at the University of Miami. He becomes a PADI certified scuba dive master, and he takes up competitive wheelchair racing later in his life and carries the Olympic torch in '96. And later he competes twice for the United States in the Paralympic Games in Greece and Australia. And so there's these stories just, written about us and sort of updating the community about our lives. And all this time I'm growing up and I'm thinking, this is amazing to be the focus of this news coverage and to see how these stories can inspire and comfort readers and veterans and their families. And, I inherited my mother's English skills more than my dad's acumen with algebra and calculus. So engineering was not really in the cards. And so by the time I'm in junior high in Miami, I gravitate to the student newspaper, and I decide this is going to be my career. I love this. And I had these great teachers through junior high and through high school. and then in college at Missouri. And I had my life all spelled out. I was going to be a reporter. I was going to win a Pulitzer by age 30. I was going to become an editor, and then I'm going to retire to teach college journalism full time. And it pretty much works out that way. I wasn't until it was 34 before the Pulitzer came. I was on the team at the Wall Street Journal that won the Pulitzer for breaking news for coverage of the 9/11 attacks. And I was in Washington. I saw the plane hit the Pentagon, and I was the first one to call it into the office. But you'd mentioned the Pulitzer in 2013 that we won for the NYPD series on spying on innocent Muslims in New York. And I was so excited. I called I tracked down my junior high school newspaper advisor from 3 decades earlier, and I said, hey, I just wanted to let you know this happened. The Pulitzer Prize, and I'm crushed. I'm disappointed because she says, hey, that's terrific, but you're not my first student to win a Pulitzer. I've actually had 3. So
wow,
it brings me right back to life.
Okay, so your career, I read off the things that you're best known for. There's a lot of other stuff, a lot of other stuff before that. Was there a turning point moment for you where it crystallized that you were like, hey, not only am I going to do this, but I'm going to be really impactful with it?
I had such great teachers, and I think that's one of the reasons I wanted to get into teaching journalism is to help sort of return the favor. Teachers who encouraged me to take risks and tackle these really big investigative reporting projects. Even in the 80s at Missouri, I wrote a piece about the local police department that was moving from revolvers to a particular model of a semi-automatic pistol. And these pistols were resulting in negligent discharges all over the United States. And suspects were getting shot and killed, and police officers themselves were shooting themselves. And I'm 20 years old. And and a couple of years later, I'm at AP, and my boss says, I pitched the idea, I'm going to catalog all of the political contributions from all the special interests to the state lawmakers in Indiana, to track political favors behind the scenes. And this has never been done before. And now it's sort of always done, that it's tracked electronically. But back in the early 90s, it was all kept on paper. And so I created a data system, and we input all the data, and we were just killing it with these great accountability stories about this lawmaker taking money from this industry and turning out these legislative favors. And I just had such great bosses over the years to let me do that stuff.
Was there, and I've asked this of a few of the most veteran people that we've talked to, was there a mistake earlier in your career that proved to be a real learning moment that you carried with you for the next 30 years or so?
Yeah. So there's actually 2, if you've got the time to entertain them. But and I share these with my students because I think it is really important to learn from your mistakes and sort of figure out what not to do. So in the early 90s, I'm an AP reporter, and I'm in Oklahoma, and I'm at a crime scene outside a house where this violent felon is holding his grandmother hostage in a standoff, and it's gone on for days. And police have tried to talk him out, and that's failed. And they actually send in a robot with a camera to try to scope out what's going on, and he blows it to pieces, and they have to drag what's left of it out on a rope. And it's pretty obvious that after, I think we were in the second or even the third day, that the SWAT team was going to have to storm the house with guns blazing. And so I get on the phone with my desk editor, and we start building what we call a preparedness, right? It's a story that's written, but it's held internally as though the event had already happened, so we can update it and then broadcast it when the facts emerge. And it's just faster to do it that way than to start from scratch. And so the draft story says police stormed the house and shot the hostage taker. And it includes the background about, what had been happening over the previous several days and who the hostage was. And the editor gives it to the broadcast desk to get it ready to publish, but we're not going to publish it. And pretty soon, the pagers for all of the reporters from all the other news organizations around me start beeping. And one of them says, AP's reporting the police stormed the house. And I said, wait, what? I'm on the phone with my editor and I said, you didn't publish that, did you? And he said, no, I didn't publish it. But he gave it to the broadcast desk, and the broadcast desk inadvertently published it, thinking that it had already happened. And so, the story gets blasted out. Coincidentally, right as police storm the house and shoot the hostage taker. So, but it was really embarrassing, and it could have had horrible consequences. And I've always since then been very careful about handling preparedness. Since then, we pre-write people's obituaries as though they've already died, and there are all kinds of stories that we do behind the scenes. But boy, I always put a big note at the top now: do not publish, do not publish. So the other one is years later, I'm in Washington, and I was assigned to cover one of the biggest business trials of the century. The Justice Department is suing Microsoft for antitrust violations. And the government wants one of the most successful technology companies broken up into pieces. And, including the appeals, that trial went on for nearly 2 years. And one day after court, it's raining, it's pouring down rain. And I flagged a cab in front of the courthouse, and I see the trial judge, the federal judge, come walking out. And I know that Judge Jackson walks home almost 22 city blocks to Georgetown every night, and it's pouring. And so I rolled down the window and I said, Judge, you want to share my cab? Now he knows who I am. He knows I'm a reporter. I've been in the courtroom since day one of the trial. I was the only reporter to score an interview with Bill Gates during the trial. And the judge gets in the cab and he starts a tirade because Microsoft's chief executive officer, Bill Gates, won't show up in his courtroom. He says that Gates is a coward, and he notes that Bill Gates testified to Congress just a couple blocks from my courthouse, but he won't show up in my courtroom. And he pretty much makes clear, like, he's going to rule against Microsoft, and he's no fan of this company or Bill Gates. And I'm sitting in the back seat. I can't believe he's saying all this in front of a journalist who's been covering the trial. And so, I call him that evening when he gets home, and I said, look, I can't pretend that you didn't say all these things to me right in the middle of the trial. This is news, and I'm going to write a story quoting you. And he says, oh, you can't do that. That was all off the record. And I said, that's not how this works. You can't, unilaterally and after the fact say something was off the record after you already blurted it out in front of a reporter. And, you're somebody who deals with reporters all the time. I mean, you're not just, somebody who suddenly finds themselves in the spotlight. And so, you should know better. And so he offers to cut a deal with me. And he says, if I sit on his comments, he will sit down with me for an exclusive one-on-one interview at the end of the trial after the verdict. And he's going to walk me through all of his reasoning and review all of the testimony and what he thought about all the witnesses. And I talked about it with my editor, and my editor says, that's a pretty good deal. I think we should hold off and get the exclusive with the judge afterward. But we shouldn't have waited. We should have published those remarks right then. It was news. The judge eventually rules against Microsoft, but he gets thrown off the case because the appeals court says he exhibited bias against Microsoft, and they had to do a whole other trial where Microsoft ends up faring much better. But I tell my students, don't ever take a deal like that. That, when you have what you think is a real blockbuster story, report the story. Don't get sucked into this, well, there could be a better story if you keep this secret.
Fast forwarding here to the present time, in the context of all of the Collier Prize nominees that you've read, all the investigative journalism that you've done, everything that you've looked at in the past, what is the state of investigative journalism in the United States right now?
It's surprisingly good. We had more than 6 nominations to the Collier Prize, 60 applicants, and some news organizations did such fantastic work that they were able to nominate, more than one from their own newsroom. The state of journalism is quite good. These were reliable, credible, accurate, investigative packages that really uncover sometimes criminal wrongdoing, sometimes negligence by state government agencies. And so one thing that we did see was, and we've seen this emerging for a few years now, is the increasing use of partnerships. And that project that they did was partly funded by ProPublica, which is a whole other news organization, but ProPublica chipped in some money to help pay for the work. And we're seeing those kinds of partnerships where news organizations that in the past might have competed against each other, they've got some aligned interest, and so they're sharing costs, they're sharing reporting expertise, they're sharing editing expertise, and projects like this, big complicated projects, can get done more expediently, can get done more efficiently and more cost effectively.
Okay, so that's a trend in the field as far as overall scope goes. What about in terms of investigative reporters nowadays? You teach, you work with students close to graduation at the University of Florida. What traits do you need to be a good investigative reporter these days?
Well, the first thing you need is to care about being accurate, and you have to be careful. We are writing about incredibly sensitive subjects. We sometimes write about litigious organizations or institutions or people. So we may have to defend ourselves in court. So you need to be solid. You want to have a strong sense of right and wrong. You want to have a commitment to accountability. Institutions and organizations and governments, they should be doing what they're expected to be doing. And if they're not doing it, we should call them out. You want to be fair. You want to be honest. You want to have transparency. I teach my students, if you're writing a hard story about someone, let them know this is going to be a hard story. This is not going to be a sort of a fluffy profile. You want to be upfront with people.
You mentioned in 1990 that you built like a data set, a database essentially at that time. I'm guessing you did it on a Mac, like the original Macintosh, or an Apple IIe or something of that nature. What are the technological tools and things in technology that an aspiring investigative reporter needs to learn?
Yeah, so we've come such a long way. The data tools, especially that we have at our fingertips, being able to just as a layman, not even a sort of a data expert, being able to query 20 or 30 million records. We have classes here in the journalism school at UF where we teach data journalism, but every day my student reporters, we're using Florida's files on 15 million registered voters. We've got millions of traffic tickets through, we've got parking ticket databases. It's just all of these data sets we find come in handy for different purposes. And so, you want to have the ability to run a SQL query or do a pivot table in Excel, to be able to sort and analyze data, but to be able to scrape data off of websites. Those are incredibly important skills for today's young journalists.
Carol and Daniel's project took 2 years to do. They had thousands of pages of records. They had a very large number of interviews that they did. I just did a project, not investigative, where I interviewed 40 people and had 30 hours of audio, and trying to organize that took me months. And it was, and they talked about how it took them months to do what they did. How can reporters be effective in organizing notes, quotes, and data?
Yeah, you have to be organized. Again, I've had reporters who work on my teams come in with 2-inch bound binders that have different tabs for different interviews and transcripts. You make a copy of everything that you've ever consulted, whether it's a particular document or a transcript of an interview, lists of all of your contacts for the stories, how to get a hold of them, when's the last time you talked with them, what were the circumstances of that. And partly you want to be organized because one of my jobs as the editor at the end of the day is to come in and challenge you, run this project through the crucible of the editing process and try to tear it apart and show its weaknesses and show where we may have gotten something wrong. And you need to be able to refute all of these challenges.
Now there's a push pull there, because we were talking just before we started taping about rapid response. work with an editor, and I can only imagine how many edits the winning piece went through. And like, I can only imagine what investigative work requires with regards to editing. Is there an example maybe from your career that would show how tightly vetted work of that nature gets?
Again, we are so concerned that the story be correct and accurate and right and fair, and also that it stand up in court. And in my 30 years, I was only sued one time, and the judge threw it out because the story was accurate, the story was fair, and the story was backed up by documents. But you always are running against the possibility that you're going to get dragged into court and you're going to have to prove yourself that you were accurate. So the diligence is every fact, every date, the spelling of every name. And it doesn't mean that we always get it right. I mean, we're still human beings and we still make mistakes, but there are enormous safety nets and protocols and procedures to catch these errors before they get published. And as the news industry has shrunk, we've lost layers of editing and layers to the copy desks and things like that. And so there are fewer sets of eyeballs going on these projects, and I think that's a sort of a really risky premise. That's not going to bode well. You really need to run these stories through the ringer.
What was the process like for the coverage that you did in 2016, leading up to the presidential election?
Yeah, so that there were a number of stories that we were prosecuting in 2016 ahead of the presidential election. The one of the biggest ones was Hillary Clinton's email server, and we actually wrote that story in 24 hours. We had heard through a leak from Congress that she had used an email account, an email address that was not a State Department address to conduct official business. And the New York Times actually was the first to break that story, that she'd been using this personal email account. But I got together with my reporters and I said, well, where was that's going to be a key question. Is it in a data center that's protected and backed up and has all sorts of security experts keeping it safe, or is this just something being? And I remember literally saying, this is being, is it something being run out of her basement? And we used publicly available internet mail exchange records at the time to go back in time and look at where that email address was pointed to on the internet physically. And when the Clintons' home address in Chappaqua popped up on the records, I turned to the reporter next to me and I said, "Holy cow, she's doing this out of her house." And the reporter, Jack Gillum, and I both are sort of nerds anyway, and we had actually run email servers out of our houses, so we know what's involved, and so we knew what records to track and look for. But we also, we had been involved for many years trying to get a hold of Hillary Clinton's emails because we were trying to vet her as a candidate at the State Department. So we had been filing FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act requests with the State Department to say, like, I want to see copies of the emails that she wrote about this issue or that issue. And the State Department kept coming back and saying, we don't have them. We can't find any of her emails. And so we knew something was askew. And in fact, after the email server story came out and we wrote it, and I think what I'm most proud about is that story holds water even today. Every line in that story was borne out. And the significance that we were ascribing to her practice of doing this, and the fact that she uniquely had done this and no other government official had ever been identified as doing this. But after the email server story came out, we actually sued the State Department in federal court for failing to turn over and failing to manage the government records. And the State Department paid us $154,000 to settle the case, paid all of our legal fees, for years of trying to go after this. But that story, when it was published, there were 9 days when Hillary Clinton refused to either acknowledge that we were right or dispute that we were wrong. And people outside our newsroom were starting to have doubts about, well, maybe AP got it wrong. I mean, it seems like she would have come forward by now. 9 whole days, and then she has a speech at the United Nations and admits everything and says, I didn't do anything against the rules, but and you know, I, I I think the rules were pretty clear that she wasn't supposed to be doing that. But yeah, for 9 days we were left hanging, and she had told all of her people who were involved, stop talking about this. Don't say anything. And some of them were very upfront with us when we would talk to them, and they would say, look, I'm under orders not to talk about this with you especially.
And it should be pointed out too that you also broke stories, very significant stories about things in the other party.
Yeah, we focused on President Trump's then candidate Trump's campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, also his national security advisor, Michael Flynn. But we exposed Manafort's illegal foreign lobbying, and ended up getting him indicted and imprisoned. He pleaded guilty. He went to prison, got pardoned, and was released. And he's got a book coming out in September, so I can't wait to hear what he's going to say about us. But his business partner from years earlier, long before he was affiliated with the Trump campaign, his business partner was a billionaire Russian oligarch, Oleg Deripaska. And Deripaska sued us over our coverage about his business interactions with Paul Manafort. He wanted desperately to find out how we had uncovered all of this stuff, and who was our source. And the judge threw the case out before we even got to discovery. So we were fine.
Speaking of which, the Politico breaking the story the other day about how the Supreme Court is going to rule on abortion, and the quest now to find out how did they get that, how did that leak. Do you have any perspective on that you wish to share? Because that's going to be a fascinating story to watch.
Yeah, so I've been wrapped up in government leaks investigations a few times in my career, and it's really scary when you're the journalist who's written the story that suddenly the FBI wants to know, how did you find that out? I've had the FBI agents show up at my front door demanding my emails. The FBI went to Verizon and turned over months of my home phone records without any warning to me. The government figured out everyone that I had talked with for months, whether it was on the story that they cared about or other stories. And it's just, it can be a scary process. And I ironically, Josh Gerstein, one of the two reporters who wrote that piece for Politico, used to report specifically on leaks investigations in Washington. So Josh is pretty uniquely situated to know how these leaks investigations are going to run and what are the consequences here. We are very sensitive in journalism to protecting our sources, especially our confidential sources. And you talked about the data work and how do you stay organized. And we use a lot of the cloud services, right? We use Google Docs, and we use the OneCloud and iCloud and OneDrive and Dropbox. But we also are very sensitive not to use those cloud services when we're dealing with sensitive stories like this, because those are operated by third-party companies. And if the FBI or the government wants to find out who our sources are, they'll simply go to Google or Microsoft or Dropbox with a warrant, and those companies they'll turn over all your secrets. And so on the really sensitive stories, and we had a lot of them, we work strictly locally off encrypted hard drives and encrypted thumb drives, because if the government's going to get it, they're going to have to come through our front door, and they're going to have to get it, and then they're going to have to either ask us to decrypt it, or they're going to have to break our encryption, because we're not going to tell them who our sources are.
Certainly movies have been made about this, and I'll ask you in a second. I have a question that's related to movies and books that you might recommend, but I can't pass up the chance, if we're going to talk about 2016, making the call on presidential election winners. Can you give us kind of a broad strokes inside the room perspective on what that's like, and what particularly it was like in 2016?
So, the Associated Press is sort of the de facto race caller. When AP calls an election, we're not saying who's winning at that moment. When we call a race, it means that candidate has won the race. There's enough evidence, there's enough votes coming in that we know who the winner is. And there are only 7 of us in the company at any one time calling these races. I started doing it back in 2004. And, we study these races for months before the election. I mean, it really becomes almost a separate full-time job. And, you find and you analyze all of the polls and you're looking for consistency or inconsistency. We use these incredibly sophisticated mathematical models, these statistical models that are applied to real-time vote counts in every single state. And then, they're reapplied, microseconds later. And so, you have all of these quality assurance checks, and it goes through, 2 or 3 layers of quality assurance checks, within AP. So if a county or a township that traditionally has voted Republican suddenly swings blue that night, there's a big red flag there, and we're alerted immediately, and we're gonna investigate before we accept those results. So it's a real sort of quality assurance check. And we don't say, candidate X is winning, we say candidate X has won. Some politicians, hate that. They just don't understand what we're doing. Carly Fiorina was the former CEO of Hewlett Packard, and she was running for the US Senate in California back in 2010. And I had enough votes in my models at that point that night to project that her opponent, Barbara Boxer, was going to win easily. And so AP, we called the race. And Fiorina's campaign manager gets on the phone with me in Washington, and she says, we're not conceding. We're actually ahead by 700,000 votes right now. Like, you're out of your mind calling this race. We're winning. How could you call the race the other way? And I said, look, the math doesn't lie, and you're going to lose by 1 million votes by the end of the night. So I'm satisfied, and I'm sorry that you're not, but like, the AP call stands. And at the end of the night, she won by 1,751,000 votes. The models are just incredibly sophisticated, and the people who work in them are brilliant, and and the vote counts are just incredibly reliable. When Charlie Crist lost the governor's race in Florida to Rick Scott in 2014, I called that race too, and Crist was standing next to the AP correspondent, and I'm talking to the AP correspondent telling him, okay, we're calling the race for Scott. You can tell Crist, like, sorry you lost. And Chris gets on the phone with me on the line in Washington, and I kind of walked him through the math, and he asks a couple of questions like, well, have you considered this? Have you considered, absentee votes? Yes, I've already accounted for those. And he says, okay, I guess you're right. And he calls Scott and concedes. So, sometimes they understand, they're professional about it. But there's so much pressure to get it right and to get it first. And when you're a projections analyst, you're actually measured, your job performance, you're measured by the seconds, by how you called the race ahead of like the networks. And if you call a race wrong, you lose your job, like you're fired. So it is very high stakes, but it's so much fun and just intellectually challenging.
How many times was it said, are you sure, in 2016 when you were in the final seconds of that?
Yeah, so funny story. So AP had not called Wisconsin, and Wisconsin was my state to call that night among about 10 states that I had. And I was ready. I mean, I was sure. And there was one anomaly in one of the counties, but I had already run it down and had determined there weren't nearly enough votes to help tilt the election the other way around. So I was telling my boss, like, we could call Wisconsin. And I was hyper focused just on this one state. He was, of course, looking at the whole board and realizing that as soon as we call Wisconsin, that's going to put Trump over the bar, and he's going to be declared the president of the United States, and we want to make sure that we're right on this. And so, he kept coming back to me saying, "Have you checked that one county?" And yes, I kind of walked them through my math, and I said, "Look, just for grins, I mean, if the vote in that county is trending, this, and if you double Clinton's margin in that county, he's still going to win." So, it's not going to change the outcome. And finally, finally I got him to move on it. And AP, I think at 2:30 in the morning, was the first to announce that Trump was going to be president. But
Were you glad to sit out 2020?
no, I miss it terribly. Yeah, this is really, it really is exciting. And I had a little bit of it in 2020 at UF. I was helping run some of the local election coverage, some of our congressional races, and of course our gubernatorial race in 2018. And I had sort of replicated some of the functionality of what AP did with spreadsheets and databases, and was able to kind of walk my students like, this is how it's going to
Sure.
work when you get a job. So
Wow. All right. So 2 questions to close. One, is there a void or shortage that an aspiring reporter can look to fill? The person that asked that I had an intern for a while, and she would ask that of every person that we had because she was an aspiring journalist at the time.
yeah. So, journalism is a trade. It's not an art. You can learn this. It's a specialized trade, and I'm happy to be at the University of Florida and teach some pretty sophisticated journalism practices. But getting that specialized subject matter expertise, climate change, covering the intelligence community. You want to cover the CIA or the DNI in Washington, you're pretty much going to name your gig and name your salary. Those reporters who cover the FBI and the DOJ and do it well and are well sourced with high level officials and have an understanding of how the system interoperates with the executive branch and the legislative branch and even the judicial oversight with the FISA court. These are fairly sophisticated mechanisms, and you can pretty much call your shots. They have negative unemployment. They're constantly turning away offers for jobs. So I think in election years, covering politics and covering elections are in high demand. We're fortunate this year with the midterms coming up in November, the graduating class that just got out of UF, I had pretty much 100% employment. Even months before they graduated, all of my students had jobs lined up. And many of them are covering politics. One student's going to be covering President Trump for the Palm Beach Post in his own backyard in his own hometown newspaper. So she's very excited about that. But yeah, I think getting that subject matter expertise, economics, environment, intel, law enforcement, those are pretty high value jobs right now.
So the last question, the podcast is called The Journalism Salute. And I typically would ask you to name someone that you want to salute for your good work, but I want to combine this with another question. I imagine that the reading list for your investigative journalism class is really, really good. And the movie list and all the other things that you put together. Are there things you would recommend among reading movies, documentaries, feature films, whatever, that relate to the field where you would salute the people that were either in them or the people that made the film for their good work?
Yeah. We read a lot of modern investigative reporting. We want to see how the professionals are doing it. Sometimes we read it critically. Maybe that's not how we want it, because sometimes investigative journalism is not done as well as it could be. But yeah, we watch clips from the films like you described, All the President's Men and Spotlight. I show those in my classes. The one on Richard Jewell, for example, to show how investigative reporting can get off track and go wrong and really, ruin somebody's life. That's an important lesson too. But we look at a lot of the entrants to the Collier Prize, because that is sort of the marquee of state government investigative reporting. I think John Cox of the Washington Post does an incredible job. He writes a lot about gun violence and gun rights, and I think does a really sophisticated job of it. But yeah, there's so many great reporters. I mean, Carol Miller down at the Herald, the deputy investigations editor, is so intense and so polished and just wants to do the best stories and get them right and have a positive impact on these people's lives. So
that's great. I learned that from talking to her, certainly the intensity. Ted Bridis, thank you for taking the time to join us. Very appreciative that you would give me your time to talk.
Sure. Happy to be here. Thank you.
On the Journalism Salute, we offer interviews that are thoughtful, diverse, and smart. Khushbu Shah, the editor-in-chief of the Fuller Project.
What we do differently is that we center women in our stories, whether they're sources or experts.
By Ken Lemon, Vice President for Broadcast and the Chairman of the Black Male Media Project for the National Association of Black Journalists.
Promoting diversity and fairness for journalists, and that's been kind of a big peg of what we've done lately.
We're joined by PJ Cabrera. PJ is a teacher.
And we focus on what we do matters because I think a lot of student journalists need to understand that the work that they're doing in their newsrooms is important.
Bettina Chang, the co-founder and executive editorial director of City Bureau.
If we could train more people of color to be journalists, that we would put ourselves on a better path where journalism might be more equitable, might be more responsive to the needs of communities.
The Journalism Salute allows journalism to show the best of itself. Tune in and join the conversation.
Welcome to Journalism History, a podcast that rips out the pages of your history books to re-examine the stories you thought you knew and the ones you were never told.
I'm Terry Finneman, and I research media coverage of women in politics.
And I'm Nick Hirschon, and I research the history of New York sports.
And I'm Ken Ward, and I research the journalism history of the Great Plains and Rocky Mountains. Find the Journalism History Podcast at journalism-history.org/podcast and wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts.
Thank you for listening to the Journalism Salute. Please let us know what you think of the show. You can find us on Twitter at JournalismPod, and you can email us at journalismsalute@gmail.com.